Hello, and welcome to the Banff at Altitude podcast, celebrating 50 years of adventure storytelling from the Banff Centre Mountain Film and Book Festival. Since its beginning in 1976, the Banff Centre Mountain Film and Book Festival has been a gathering place in celebration of all things mountain culture. The yearly festival, hosted at Banff Centre for Arts and Creativity, fosters an appreciation of the world's mountain places by creating opportunities for people to share and find inspiration in mountain experiences, ideas, and visions. Over the years, we've spoken to hundreds of incredible adventurers who share their spectacular and moving stories. My name is Joanna Croston, and I'm going to be digging through our festival archives to revive some of our favorite presentations from the past to get you stoked for what's to come in 2025, our 50th anniversary. And well, hopefully you'll be stoked for life in general. In continuing with this tradition of sharing stories and connections, we hope this podcast will inspire you to explore, preserve, and enjoy the great outdoors. In 2023, we had the joy of welcoming Mingma G. Sherpa to Banff. Mingma G. began climbing at the age of 20 and has become a prominent member of the international climbing community. His list of accomplishments is long and impressive: 5 summits of Everest, 4 summits of Manaslu, as well as summits on Kanchenjunga, Annapurna, Lhotse, Dhaulagiri, Nanga Parbat, Gasherbooms 1 and 2, Broad Peak, and a solo ascent of Mount Cho Bujie. His most historic ascent was acting as team leader on the first ever winter ascent of K2. In conversation with local Bow Valley host Jeff Powder, Mingma G talks about his K2 ascent, cleaning up garbage left on Everest with his sisters, and climbing 13 of the 14 8,000-meter peaks without supplemental oxygen. Since this recording in 2023, Mingma G has become the first Nepali to climb all 14 8,000ers without oxygen. In conversation with Jeff Powder from our Voices of Adventure series, this is Mingma G. Sherpa.
Good morning, folks. Welcome to Voices of Adventure. It's absolutely lovely to see a full house today, and I completely understand why, given who the guest is. My name is Jeff Powder, and I'm the host of this series. This is edition year 25 of this series, so feeling pretty wonderful. A lot of the guests that have come here over the course of many, many years now have had tremendous stories that have brought them to this point in their life to have these kinds of discussions. But one of the unique things about this particular story is just getting the guest here has been an adventure. So in case some of you don't know the story, last year about this time, Mingma Sherpa was in Pakistan. We were fervently waiting to see if he was going to get the visa permit from the Canadian government, and it looked like it was going to happen. And then 2 days before the festival, we kind of pulled the plug thinking it would never happen. And then I think it was the next day that you actually got the visa. So we were really sad that it couldn't happen last year. And I've already been hearing from folks this morning who drove from distant places to come to last year's. So thank you so much for coming back again. And then this time, when we thought it was going to be pretty straightforward because Mingma had a visa from a year ago, on October 7th, he was involved in a well-publicized rescue of several climbers caught in an avalanche on Shishapangma, and he went out of his way to help with that rescue. And that day, he had a pretty terrible fall of about 180 meters down a steep snow slope, avoiding one rock and then hitting a bunch of other rocks on the way down, leaving him with an open fractured skull, with a broken eye orbit, a broken cheekbone, a badly damaged shoulder and leg, and a broken coccyx. And he decided he wanted to come anyways. He also needed CPR to be able to get here, so he ended up having CPR in the mountain, then stood up and under his own steam got down the mountain, and then rode for 6 days on horseback, I think, to get to a trailhead, and then to a hospital in Kathmandu, and now here he is on your behalf to be here. But I think it's fair to say that this is what we've come to expect from our Sherpa friends: never daunted, unparalleled in their toughness, strength and fortitude, always ready to go the extra mile for us. And what strength there is in today's guest. Since he first touched his first mountain in 2007, an 8,000-meter mountain, by the way, He stood on the summits of 8,000-meter peaks 30 times, most often without supplemental oxygen. And he was a key player in the remarkable all-Nepali first winter ascent of K2 in 2001, one of the greatest achievements in Himalayan history. Mingmaji has emerged as one of the strongest Nepali climbers at a fascinating time of shift in Himalayan history. For years, the story of Nepali climbers was their role as the all-too invisible legs and lungs of most expeditions, with their service, their work, and their risk sometimes barely acknowledged in accounts of their climbs. But with the explosion of commercial guiding in the Himalayas since the mid-1980s, the world of climbing by Nepalis and the world of Himalayan climbing itself has dramatically changed. Nepali climbers are now very much the often visible heart and brains of most of the climbs of the big peaks. But this has also been a time of complicated controversy about those same developments. Controversy which is very vivid and perhaps even more complicated for the Nepali climbers themselves. And we'll talk about that with Mingmaji today. Mingmaji's story over the past few years is tightly connected to many of those changes, which see Nepalis and similar groups in the Karakoram and other ranges becoming certified guides in their own right, becoming owners of guiding companies themselves, getting money directly from clients, and showing dramatic improvements in safety and skills. And perhaps the biggest change of all are climbing for themselves, for the love of the sport, and for the love of the same mountains that we love. It's a huge privilege to have Mingma here, finally, to talk about all these things and more. Mingmaji. So I want to begin, first of all, how are you? This was quite an adventure that I just mentioned. How are you feeling?
I'm good. I'm still recovering, but I'm in a good state now.
I can't even imagine stepping onto a plane with a broken tailbone for 13, 14 hours of flying.
I was fine on the plane. Like at home, I think I was alone and I was thinking too much. Right? So I thought like it's better to go outside. Yeah. I can't go for climbing now, but at least I can come here. Yeah.
Good. I want to begin right back at the very beginning and talk about your childhood, but first a little bit just so we can understand this. When I was telling people last year and again this year that you were coming, and I just mentioned this was Mingmaji that was coming, one of the things that people said is, which Mingma is that? Because that's, so let's talk about your name for a little bit. So Mingma is a day of a week, correct?
Yeah, so Mingma is Tuesday.
Tuesday.
So we have a culture that I was born on Tuesday, so I started my name with Mingma.
So this is the reason why there's a whole lot of Mingmas, not one out of every seven, but...
So second name is important in our culture.
Right, and your second name is Gyalje, which is
right.
And what's Gyalje? What does that mean?
Gyalje it's like on the parade flag, we have a copper on the top, that's called Gyalje.
That's the Gyalje.
Yeah.
Okay. And there's lots of other famous Mingmas who also have a G in their middle name or their other name as well. So Mingma David is one of those, who's also a Mingmaji, but now he goes by Mingma David.
Yeah, right. Okay. Since we have like several names and people get confused, so I started writing like only Mingmaji. Now, particularly Mingmaji means only me now.
Only you now, okay. Well, and I love that too because Mingmaji sounds like the kind phrase. That this is my friend, Mingma, my friend.
I think it's okay with like friends from outside Nepal because Ji doesn't mean big thing, but in Nepal like Ji means kind of respect.
Yeah.
No?
Yeah. Well, I think you have that from these people, anyways. Mingmaji. I want to talk to you about your childhood, because we heard yesterday in one of the presentations, for instance, about Royal Robbins growing up in poverty and hardship and so on, but I think we're talking about a different level of difficulty in the circumstances of lots of people who are Sherpas who become climbers. Where were you born?
I was born in Rolwalling Valley. It's in the northeast of Nepal.
Okay.
So I was born at the altitude of like 14,000 feet.
At 14,000 feet?
Yeah.
And what was the name of your village?
It's called Na.
Na.
Yeah.
Okay. And that's also close to another village called Beiding, which used to be the largest village in Rolwalling, right?
So Na is more for like a spring and monsoon time, and Beiding is more for autumn, and Lower Beiding is during the winter time.
Okay.
So winter time we get lots of snow, so we go down lower places.
And did you grow up in a place that had yaks and zokyoks and...
Yeah, I spent my first 11 years with yak, zokyok, I slept with them. We didn't have like big building, a small hut. So half of the place is for the animal, not for the big one, but for the small, the calves. When they get born, they are kept there, and half was for us. So we used to sleep on the floor, all family together.
And how many children were in the family? How many did you grow up with?
So we were 6. I got elder sister, elder brother, and 3 younger sister.
The elder brother is often an interesting story in Buddhist culture in Nepal, to become a monk.
Yeah,
He went
my
to a
brother became a
monastery
monk, yeah.
and became a monk.
Yeah.
And where does he live now?
He's in Kathmandu. He's in monastery.
In a monastery
Yeah.
in Kathmandu. He's actually at Kolpan Monastery.
He's
which is a
in
very
Kapan
famous
monastery. Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
So now he keeps on traveling to many countries. So he now started teaching meditations. Yeah. And he finishes like a PhD.
That's quite a remarkable
Yeah.
story
Yeah.
to go from the village with half animals and half people huts to getting a PhD and
Yeah.
teaching meditation around the world. So a lot of achievers in the family.
Right.
Including 3 of your sisters, that those of you may have seen this. It was last year or the year before, the film about the 3 Sherpani girls who went on to climb the 7 summits and climb Mount Everest, and those are Mingma sisters who were in that film. And I want to go back to the village because it's quite interesting. I think what's happening there is happening in a lot of villages in Nepal, which is everybody's kind of leaving, especially the younger people.
Yeah, it's getting empty now. Now we can barely find like 20 people, and they are mostly like old, and those who are not married.
Right.
The girls who are not married, so they are living there because they don't have educations, so they cannot afford for their livelihood. So they stay in the valley, working on their field.
And what are the fields? This is potatoes and
Yeah, grow potatoes. We just have potato.
only potatoes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Potato and radish.
So where does the other food come from in your village?
So we need to take from lower places. So it used to take a week before, but now it's a 1 day drive and 2 days of walk.
1 day of drive, 2 days of walk
Yeah.
to get there. Yeah. The other thing is that the change that you're talking about, as I understand it, in the 1940s, 1950s, Beiding, it was a part of the trade route coming down over the Melung Pass from Tibet, and there were as many as 1,000 people living in the village in the 1940s and 1950s, and now you say there's 30 people living there.
Yeah, my grandfather, he came from Tibet and he got married with my grandmother, and they settled there. So that's how we are related with Tibet. So the Tibetan people, they used to cross a big pass. It's like almost like 5,400, I think. And they used to bring salt, and they used to take back animals.
And the pass you're talking about is up to the north, 2 famous mountains there, Melong Se and
Yeah, there's a
Gauri Shankar, so
right.
it's right between those
Yeah.
2. And when you were growing up, tell us a little bit about how important were the mountains for you? Were they part of your story? Were they central to the way you saw the world? Or what do they mean to you, these big mountains?
So I just knew that my father was to go to Kathmandu, and from there he used to go different places, taking our foreign friends on climbing. We used to hear like a radio. When some people, when there are some accident or when there are some success, like no other news, but only from Everest. I still remember in 1992 when there was a big accident at Everest. So the first Nepali woman who climbed Everest, she died, and 3 of the Sherpa guides, they were from our place, and one of them was my uncle. And it was big news at the time. So we used to hear lots of things on the radio, and even like my father, he used to guide a lot when at his young age. And in 1982, he was on Everest in the wintertime, and he lost his 8 fingers there.
Okay. Tell us that story. Why did he end up losing his fingers?
It was winter time, and it was in like 8,000 meter. So his client, he had a problem on his shoes. So my father took out his gloves and helped him. And before putting his gloves, he already knew that his hand was already frozen.
So once again, in the service of helping a client,
Yeah.
and he lost 8 of his fingers. So your father was a high-altitude porter / guide. Your grandfather did some expedition work as well?
My grandfather worked as a porter. They used to carry a load over the Tashi Lodge Pass. So in 1950s, when Saudi Arabia and Hillary, they went for Everest, they went over the Tashi Lodge. So they had climbed so many peaks in Rolling Valley. So my grandfather, there used to be a porter for them as well. But he never worked on like 6,000 meter peaks, or he never climbed any peaks.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
So when you grew up with these stories of your fathers of going on these mountains with these foreign people, did you want to do that yourself? Was that a goal for you?
No.
I do want to talk about school because that's an interesting part of your story too. The school that you went to was one of many Hillary schools that were built by Sir Edmund Hillary and his foundation.
Right.
Through that whole area.
So the problem was that we were in a place where there was no any like communication, no road facility, and since it was like at 4,200 meters, our teachers, they used to come from Kathmandu. And they used to be there just for 2 weeks or 3 weeks or a month. And during the winter, it's all closed because we used to have snow like almost like 3 months in a year.
Yeah, that seems like nothing to us, but that's but you were in a very small village, so not many children from the village went there. And then eventually you realized you can't keep on going there. You don't want to keep on going there because the school just isn't the right.
No, the thing was that in the beginning it was okay because I had lots of friends over there. Then slowly the people from Rolwaling, they start getting more and more jobs.
Yeah.
So they start earning more and more money. Like my father or my friends' parents, they start realizing that education is very important. And they started taking their children to Kathmandu and they start settling there. So I was almost the last one to come to Kathmandu.
Really?
Because all my friends, they were taken to Kathmandu, and I was still going to the school in Rolwaling, and we didn't have teacher for many months sometimes. Then once I asked my uncle that all my friends went to Kathmandu, and my father could not afford my education in Kathmandu because I knew that it was costly. So I asked him like if he could help. And after a few months, he came to Rolwaling and he took me to Kathmandu. That's how I got the opportunity to go to school in Kathmandu.
And how old were you when you left your family to go to Kathmandu?
I was 11.
You were 11 at
Yeah.
that point. Okay. Your uncle who paid for your school, who brought you to Kathmandu, had support from one of his clients, and your uncle was a famous guide as well. What was his name?
His name is Dawatashi. So he's one of the first Nepali guide who climbed K2 from Nepal for the first time. So he used to take lots of like Japanese and Norwegian clients. He had climbed Everest from 3 different routes, and he was like very strong on the mountain. So also there was my another uncle called Naung Yenden. He was the first Nepali guide who made winter ascent on Everest. So he was famous from 1980s. So they started a guiding company. Then it became more like a family business. So they started hiring more and more Sherpa from Rolwaling because they knew everyone from there, and they knew who was strong, who was not physically was not so strong, right? And my uncle was strong at the time. So he started training him, and they made him a guide.
And did you know that you were from a famous climbing family? Was that even part of your understanding as a child?
No. At the time, no. But we still have lots of stories. Like my father, before he was like 23 years old, he used to be a climbing Sherpa on like 8,000 meter peaks. So my father, he was with the Ronald Master. He was with Chris Burlington. So he was on Lochi with Ronald Master and on Dhaulagiri with Chris Burlington.
So it's a very strong connection to lots of climbing history. When you went to Kathmandu to go to school, how was that for you? Because you were saying earlier you were only getting maybe a few weeks or a few months of education.
Yeah.
So when you went to a formal school in Kathmandu, what was that like for you?
So in our place, we have our own native language. Like we speak Sherpa, so we rarely speak Nepali. And I was very weak in Nepali when I was in school in Rolwaling. I was a good student, but 3 months a year we used to be in school. Then in rest 9 months, we didn't have our teacher in Rolwaling.
Right.
But like we used to be in the examinations, but it was not necessary for us to write everything on the paper. They used to write themselves because the teachers, they had to get salary from the government, right? So they used to write themselves, and they used to upgrade us. Like I was studying grade 1, so even I was failed, they used to take me in grade 2, and they just send the report to government. Okay, they're doing well. We have like students. Yeah.
And when you went to Kathmandu, you were supposed to be in grade 5, but what
So
happened?
in Kathmandu, I was supposed to be in grade 5, because I finished my grade 4 in my place, but they took me all the way to kindergarten.
And what was that like for you? Is that hard? Is that
because-
embarrassing? What does it feel like?
It was embarrassing because I was taken to kindergarten with the small children, right? I was 11 years, so I was a big guy.
Yeah.
I was kept with the small children, and it's a bit difficult to sit with the children, right? So I had a fight with the children. Yeah. Oh, yeah. On the first day, I slapped a baby girl.
Slapped a baby
Yeah,
girl.
and it is a big complaint at the school. So my teacher, they said like, he cannot be in this class. He has to be maybe in grade 1, where the children are a bit bigger. Yeah, of my age. Yeah. Then I did very well in grade 1. Then in a month I was taken to grade 2.
So just to put this in context to you now, how many languages do you speak now?
I think 6, but not that perfectly. So I speak my own Sherpa. I speak Nepali. I can speak Tibetan, but not that good. Chinese, English, Hindi, and I speak some Japanese. I still speak quite well, but I didn't work with Japanese for a long time.
So let's just say that it's about you and your ability and your strength, regardless of whether you get put into kindergarten or not, that there's something that's pretty special about you
Right.
to be able to do that. Yeah. Well, I mentioned before, too, that I think the idea that we have of the support people in your country is very much that they're very welcoming. They really like to help and connect and to serve, and I think that's part of it, too, that you're very good at connecting with others and
Right.
being helpers for others.
Right.
Yeah. To that point, when you finished high school, you suddenly had a choice to go on an expedition, or you created a choice to go on an expedition with your uncle. Tell us about that. Why did you decide to go for the first time?
I always had as in my mind that I at least want to do one expeditions because that was the environment I grew up. So in my childhood, my father, my uncle, almost like every male in the family, they used to share lots of stories from different mountain. So I wanted to live that life, at least for once. So I finished my school in 2006. Then I had like 3 months holiday, and I had nothing to do. And it was the exact time the spring exhibition were starting. So since my uncle was a guide, he had a team on Manasulu, and I just asked if I could join him. And I joined as a Sherpa without any training, without any education.
So the first time you touched a mountain was on an 8,000 meter peak.
Yeah.
First time you used
Yeah.
equipment. So when you had that experience, you got up fairly high. You got up above 7,000 meters. Is that
I
right?
got like 6,500
Okay.
because that was the highest point they went. So it actually it was a cleaning program by Japanese. So there were like 2 Japanese. They were supposed to climb all the way to the summit, and they had hired like 9 Sherpa, but only 2 Sherpa were allowed to go to the summit. So I was one of the Sherpa who were involved in cleaning program.
Cleaning the mountain, yeah. And that became quite an
Yeah,
important-
searching the garbage.
Yeah. And how did you like it? What was that experience on Manaslu like for you, and how did that set the course for you?
So my uncle was a guide, so he hired almost all the Sherpa from Rolling Valley. So they are known to me from my childhood.
Okay.
So I enjoyed the exhibition. In the daytime, we used to work, and it was like, okay, tomorrow you are going to Camon taking loads. Okay, we used to go Camon, drop the load, and come back. And after that, we used to play the card. You know, like almost like playing card every day. We get the food from the kitchen staff. We used to carry the load, put there, come back, start playing card or just chatting. So it was like very fun for me.
Yeah. So these are your friends.
Yeah.
You get to play cards.
Yeah.
You get to be in this place.
It was like 2 days of hard work or 3 days of hard work, and rest, it was enjoy all the time. Right? Yeah.
You're going to ruin the experience for people here if you say things like that.
I didn't have to wash my like plates of the food. Okay, we used to eat and we used to take it to kitchen stuff. They wash everything. They used to cook for us. Yeah. We were just there for carrying the load, and sometimes we used to go outside, dig the snow. And even while digging the snow, we used to play like hitting each other.
So I have a sense that this is, in a way, it's kind of the best time of your life. When
Yeah,
you do this.
it was the best time. And when there's like snowfall, then we were totally out of work. We had nothing to do, just stay in the tent, play cards. right? So it was quite fun at the time.
So these people all come together in this event so we can talk about how heroic and brave and strong and hard mountaineering is.
Right.
But it's really a lot of card playing and
Yeah,
throwing
right,
snow at
right,
each
right.
other.
Yeah. Yeah, I had to do much fun in my first expeditions. Then at the end, I got lots of money as well.
And so talk about that a little bit. How much did you get, and how would that compare to anything else that you could do?
So during my school, my parents, they used to give me 500 Nepal rupee, which was like $4 or $5 at the time, almost for 1 month. Whenever I need something, I used to buy. The rest money, I used to save the money. And when I was 10 years old, I used to go in somebody's house to work. So I could earn some money for my family as well. Because my father, he used to go for a walk. He used to go to Kathmandu, he used to go on the mountain, and he used to come back with $200, $300 after 2-3 months of work. And that was very less for the family.
So how much did you make on your first Manaslu trip? Do you remember?
I think I made around $1,500, which was big money at the time for us.
$1,500
Yeah.
US dollars.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's a lot suddenly.
That's a lot for a Nepali family at the time.
And a 20-year-old, I think you were when
Yeah, I was 20. Then I started, my eyes became bigger now, Then I came back to Kathmandu. For the first month, I was in school. And I had already my eyes bigger on the money. So I just ran to one of my uncle who had this guiding company. I asked him if there's a job for me. Because
So you were going to university and still
yeah,
trying to think about doing expedition.
still I was trying to find the job on the expedition.
Right.
Because at the time I started realizing that I should bring my sister back to Kathmandu and I should send them to school. Because I started realizing that education is very important.
Because otherwise your sisters wouldn't go to school.
No.
Then. No. Okay.
Then I saved them money. Then I asked my uncle if I could get another job. My uncle said, okay, we have Japanese expeditions going to Loche Southwest in winter.
So going from Manaslu, which is still an 8,000-meter peak,
Yeah.
but then to Lhotse South Face in winter,
Yeah.
that's a very different thing. Not so
Very-
much
yeah,
card
very
playing,
difficult,
not so
yeah.
much
Yeah.
throwing snowballs.
Yeah.
It's a bigger thing.
It was very hard mountain. So I learned my climbing style there.
I'm not sure that's the best advice to give to people, though. To
No,
learn how to
no,
climb big peaks on
no.
Lhotse South Face.
So it was again Japanese expeditions, so led by one of the famous climber like Watanabe Tanabe. He was very famous at the time.
Yeah.
And they were 6 Japanese, and we were 18 Sherpa in the team.
And
So
how high did you get?
I got 8,300. We were 3 Sherpa who got to 8,300, and I was among them. Yeah.
So did you think that there was, or did you start to notice that there was something special about you, that you were particularly strong or particularly okay with the cold, or what did you see in yourself?
I was physically strong, and when we started, we were in a big team. So yeah, it's the same thing again, enjoying playing cards, everything. Then we got to the base camp, and I saw the mountain. It was just rocky. And some of the friends, they were on the mountain before, and they started sharing the stories. One of our Sherpa got stuck for an hour, something. They started sharing those stories. Then I got scared there. Then we reached base camp. We had a training there. And then I went to Camon. On the first day, I was ready to run away from there. Yeah, because it was very steepy.
Yeah.
And I never climbed difficult routes before. And that was my second expedition.
So do you know that when we hear stories in our culture, when we think about doing mountain climbs, we think about lots of preparation and slowly getting ready for peaks like this. You were just thrown right into it.
Right.
Appreciating you think about, maybe I don't want to be doing this. But then do you start to feel okay with it? Does the rest of the expedition start to go better? What happens for you?
On Loche, we were a 4 Sherpa in the team. We were completely new. My uncle put us there because I was physically strong. And the rest of my 3 other Sherpa, my friends, they were also physically strong. And there were Sherpa who could fix the rope. And my uncle, maybe he just thought carried loads. He thought it was okay for us. I went on the first day, I went to Camon. I was scared and I was afraid to go back. but my uncle said, now you are on the job. You need to go back. Then I went back on second day. On second day, it was quite easier for me because like I already climbed on the first day, so second day was easier. And there were lots of friends who started teaching me, like on these places or on this condition, you need to put your leg here. Then I started learning. I knew the way to Camp 1. Then Camp 2. It was another big challenge. And our senior climbers, they used to go to Camp 2 like within six hours and used to come back. And it took 24 hours for me and my other two friends. We started at 12 o'clock at night, and next day we came back around like 12 o'clock.
Wow.
And one of my friends, he could not reach even halfway to Camp 2. He went back, and he was stuck on the way back. And we went up, and on the way down, we helped him to come down.
And
Yeah.
so when you're doing this, what kind of loads are you carrying first? How big are the loads?
It was like 15 kg, 20 kg.
So not super heavy loads, but
Not
still,
super, but it was
yeah,
very steepy place.
technically.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was hard work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And does your fear change? Do you start to feel more okay with it, or are
No,
you still afraid?
As we went higher, the route was extremely difficult.
Extremely
So I reached Camp 2, I went twice. Then I thought, okay, that's enough for me. Then I started making some excuses when my uncle, when he asked me, I had a small cut on my legs, so I was to show my uncle, okay, I have this cut, I cannot wear the boots.
I think
No?
there's a few
Yeah.
of us here that have done this before, so we understand.
And there were like 18 Sherpa in the beginning. 9 of them got injured on the way because it was very risky, so lots of rockfall.
Yeah.
9 of them got injured, but later on we knew that 2 of our friends, they just hit stone on their hand by themselves because they didn't want to continue. So everyone on the team, they just wanted to have some money and run away.
Right.
And I was also like trying to make excuses, but the guide, he never gave me like a rest day in the base camp. Like we had to get water from almost like half an hour far. So he used to make us carry water all the day.
So at some point, though, after this trip, you get to 8,300 meters, which is a huge success on
Yeah.
that wall. That's very impressive. It's pretty close to the
Yeah.
top. You come back down again, and you did say, okay, I'm going to do this again.
Yeah.
So
The thing
why,
was that
why would you do that?
we had like limited Sherpa. So the guides, he said like, okay, you need to go because the 3 Japanese guide, my uncle said, okay, try to go as high as possible with them. And in my final, because they were less Sherpa, so I helped them carry like 5 bottles of oxygen from Camp 2 all the way to Camp 3. It was like 8,300 meters. I went up with them. On the way down, I got stuck at one point. And I kept crying almost like 2 hours at the place. On the rock, there was so many old ropes, and there was iron ladder, and my back got stuck there. So I don't know how I got out, and I went straight down. Then after that, I never returned back.
So why do it again after that? Why go back to another mountain after
Because after Manasulu, when I earned like almost like 1,500, I did one of my sister already in Kathmandu.
Right.
And Loche, I earned almost like double of my Manasulu.
Okay.
Harder route, more money.
Harder
right?
route. Okay.
Yeah. And I already had my sister in Kathmandu, so she was already started going to school. Then it was necessary for me to earn more money.
But even at your risk.
Yeah, even at risk. And I was also starting myself. And one of my cousin brother, he said, we need one more Sherpa. So if you are interested, I'll put you on the Everest. And Everest was a big goal for me as well. And I said, look, okay, I'm ready to go Everest. I leave my study, I can go for Everest. If I earn better money, I'll bring my another sister to Kathmandu. That's how I started. And I went to Everest, and Everest was my first summit of my life.
So a sense of obligation, a sense of helping your family, it's worth doing it. There's great reward to be able to bring your sisters to Kathmandu.
Yeah.
But it's hard. When do you change it into more of a career to do the guiding and the climbing?
In 2007, after Everest, I wanted to quit the expedition and I wanted to focus on like a job and like my own study. But I could not because I had already 2 sisters in Kathmandu and their like education fee was already big challenge for me. And I was also studying myself and I had my university fee. Every month I had to pay so much money. Then my job was not enough for that. Then I went to Manasulu again in 2008. Then I realized I could do seasonal expeditions once in a year, and then the rest of the time I could continue my study. And then in 2010, I had an accident on Everest.
You had an accident.
Yeah.
What happened?
So I was a Sherpa for a Japanese climber. So he hired 3 Sherpa. I was one of them. 2 other Sherpa, they were senior to me. And one of them, he had already climbed Everest 10 times before. So he hired us, and we made the summit on 24th of May. While going up, it was okay. But on the way down, he started getting pain on his chest. He was not so okay.
The Japanese guy.
Yeah, the Japanese guy. And we were trying to drag him down, but we didn't have any technique at all. We were struggling to bring him down. Just holding him. And it was very slow. And when we reached back to 8,300 meters, he passed away. Yeah, he died. And
What was that like for you, to lose somebody on the mountain like that?
It was very hard because we had a great bonding on the expedition, and he wanted to sponsor one of my sister, and he wanted to sponsor my education, and he wanted to take me to Japan. So I had so many hope, and I lost him on Everest. And then I started realizing I need to have some technical training. Yeah. So right after the Everest expedition, I joined a mountaineering course in Kathmandu.
Can I just ask you about the decision to get training? Because I think it's fair to say that a lot of people working as porters, as high-altitude workers in your country, don't have very much technical training at all. Even though we might think that they do, they don't necessarily have much technical training.
I was on Choyu, I was on Manasulu, I was on Lhotse, I was on Everest without training. If we had the technique at the time, if we had a rescue technique, maybe we could have saved him.
Yeah. So I want to talk about 2 particular changes that happened for you. One of them was in 2014. You went on K2 for the first time.
Yeah.
What was that like for you? That's again a different mountain of a different scale, different difficulty and complexity. So,
in 2012, I started a small guiding company with 3 of my friends, and there we had a client from Iran. So I climbed with him on Kanchenjunga. On Everest, when we were carrying loads from north side, I carried 8 bottle oxygens and 2 tents at a time. So it was from 7,000 all the way to 8,300, the last camp.
So this is probably 40 kg load.
Yeah, almost And I knew that I was physically strong, and all those work we used to do without oxygens. So I thought I could easily climb Kanchenjunga without oxygens. So on Kanchenjunga, I climbed with my Iranian clients, and he had an interest to climb K2, and he knew that I should be with him because he knew I was strong. And I had already training, I finished my aspirant guide course, so I was technically qualified. I was a bit scared, and I was also happy that I was climbing with a client with whom I knew.
Yeah.
And I had also 2 more clients in the team. And they said we don't need oxygen, we will be climbing with you guys. We don't need any support. And on the mountain, they need lots of support. Yeah. So we had 9 bottle oxygens. All the 9 bottle oxygen carried myself.
But didn't use it?
Yeah, I didn't use. And I was climbing without. And they were on oxygens.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
And did you have a moral reason? Did you decide, I don't want to use oxygen is cheating or something like that?
No. Because when I was working as a climbing Sherpa on Everest, we were carrying so many loads, and we were doing all without oxygens. And I was more comfortable with that at the time.
Yeah, so you just know you could do it.
Yeah, and I knew that it was not that difficult. And I was physically very strong at that time. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure you were.
Yeah.
So climbing without oxygen is not that difficult. That's what we should understand.
Yeah, at the time it was not that difficult for me. Because, like I said, on Everest, our last camp is at 8,300 meters. I was taking the loads, 10 bottle of oxygens plus 2 tents. There was no limitation with the loads.
Yeah.
All the Sherpa, they had to carry 15 kg in minimum. If I carry 30 kg, That's double load. Then I could earn more money. If I can get like 45, it's triple load. So I can earn more and more money. And money was very important at the time for me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting because I think a lot of us in the West, we have romantic reasons, ideal reasons for climbing mountains, but you're talking about a very practical reason
Right.
to do it. Let me talk about the next shift then, because you started climbing for yourself. You started climbing on your
Yeah,
own.
in 2015, I did a solo climb on Chobuje. That's the mountain just in front of my house. The base camp was just an hour walk from my home.
Right.
Yeah.
And why did you do that? Why climb it alone? Why take that chance?
Yes, in 2015, we had an earthquake in Nepal, so that killed almost like 9,000 people. I lost like 6 clients on Everest, 4 clients and 2 Sherpa on Everest
Yeah.
from the avalanche, which,
Right.
which was after the earthquake, right?
Right. Right.
Then I had an invitation from Italy and Austria to share some stories about the earthquake. And one of the foreign friends, he said like, Sherpa is strong, I admired them, but they lack the technical skill. And he said like, you don't have anyone who have done a solo or something like technical climb.
It mattered to you.
Yeah, it mattered me a lot at the
Why?
time.
Why?
Because it was true, like we have a long climbing history,
Yeah.
and people blindly believe on us that if you have Sherpa, you are on safe hand,
Yeah.
right?
It was true.
Yeah, it was true.
Yeah.
Till 2010, I had the same. I was physically strong, I used to run on the mountain, but if something happens, I didn't have anything.
Right.
I could not make simple knots. 50% of Sherpa still, they don't have technical skill.
Right.
They are physically strong. They can help you carry your stuff. They can guide you all the way up and down. But if you are in a problem, they cannot rescue you.
And if they have any problem, they can't rescue
they cannot
themselves.
rescue
Yeah.
themselves. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's the problem. Still, we have. But good thing is that now we have lots of organizations which are giving so many training. Like we have KCC, which gives
The Khumbu
which are,
Climbing
yeah,
Center?
which are specialized on ice climbing. We have Nepal National Mountain Guide Association. We have Nepal Mountain Instructor Association. Now we have lots of training in Nepal, training related to rock, ice, rescue, navigation. We have everything now, and this is changing a lot. All my Sherpa, they are trained. Every winter I send them for ice climbing training. I hire a doctor to give them first aid training. I send them with my guide friends for rock climbing. So I train them myself because they wanted to have training, but they don't want to spend the money.
Right.
Yeah.
So they can't
because
afford it,
because
so-
because they hardly earn those money.
So when you went to Chobutse, which is this beautiful peak by your
Yeah.
home, and you did the solo ascent, it was a challenging ascent.
I heard like there were like 12 expeditions before, but nobody succeeded.
So it sounds like you want to prove something to the world that you can do something like that, but also prove something to yourself. Is that important to you?
At the time, I wanted to prove only those climbers who thought like Nepalese climber lacks the skill.
Right.
At the time, I had that ego. I don't have now, but I had that one at the time. Yeah. So just to prove that one, I went there. But I almost killed myself. I climbed very well. I reached the summit, and when I reached there, I missed the time calculation. I thought like it wouldn't take that much time, but it took almost the double the time that I calculated because it was very technical, and I was taking so long time. I reached the summit, and the weather turned so bad, and it started snowing. It was clouded. It covered with cloud, and I could barely see my leg. Then there was no choice. I wanted to go behind and come from different routes because I was a bit scared to come on the same route down because it was so steep and it was a bit icy. So I was a bit scared, so I wanted to go back and try to find some easier routes. Then I lost the direction, and it was very risky to continue. So I spent like 43 hours in the same place. No tent, no food, no gas, nothing.
And do you start to think to yourself, oh, I've done something stupid here. This is a bad idea.
First night, I was okay. I was pretty sure that next day the weather gonna be okay and I'm gonna come down. And next day the weather remained same. Still, I was like physically, I was very strong. I was sure that I couldn't make all the way down. Then next day, I started feeling so weak because I didn't have water and anything. All the time I was outside and it was snowing. And I dig a hole, and I was inside the hole. for 43 hours. Then I started realizing that, okay, maybe now. It's the time.
And you had to get rescued off the
Yeah, I had to get rescued. I was in contact with my team on the radio, and my mother was there. She was crying all the time. Yeah, it was hard. I learned a lot there.
Okay.
I learned to survive.
Yeah.
That was important, I think.
Yeah.
I learned to survive. So I thought, now I'm okay to go anywhere.
The learning how to go anywhere is a really good entry into probably the biggest thing that you did,
Yeah.
which is the winter ascent of K2. Why do that?
I was looking at Wikipedia, and at least I wanted to see like Nebel's flag on the Wikipedia as a first winter ascent. So I started making a plan, and I had a friend, John Sonnery, who he had climbed with me on K2 in 2017, and he saw me like how I fixed the routes on K2, and he knew how I lead the team, how I make the routes. So he started talking, then we made a plan to go winter ascent.
In 2019?
And in 2019.
Yeah.
But that didn't go well because while trekking into base camp, I started having pain on my chest. Then when I reached base camp, I was in a bad shape. I was coughing all the day, and I had a pain on my chest. Still, I continued till Camp 1. Then at Camp 1, I thought, like, if I continue, I'm going to die.
Right.
Then I wanted to stop, and I wanted to go back and have a health checkup. I went to Kathmandu, I went to hospital, and the doctor said, like, you almost got pneumonia. If you were there for a longer time, you could have died.
But you know what's interesting in that story, Mingma, is that that's about you and some of the vulnerabilities that you had
Right.
going. But when you go back again in 2021 with the rest of the Nepali group, one of the things that you said publicly was, this time we want to go back only with Nepalis because clients will just slow us down. So we want to be just
Yeah,
us.
the thing was that when we did Success K2 in 2019, then I started thinking it should be only my friends who I can trust blindly. Because winter is not that easy. So if something happens, then it's easy that you're going to be left behind. So that's the reason I choose 3 friends from my hometown, whom I know from my childhood.
And then one of the interesting things that happens, it's just the 3 of you, but then there's 7 other Nepalis who join in the mix as well
Yeah.
in the team led by Nimsdai.
Yeah.
So was it a competition between the 2 groups?
In the beginning, yes.
Yeah.
When we started from Nepal, it was. But when we were in Pakistan, we were in an international team. Nims was doing for Nepal, I was doing for Nepal. We had our personal interest, but it was more for Nepal.
And how was Nims to get along with? He's a big character. Was that hard to join the teams, or did it work really smoothly? How did that work?
I didn't have a connection with Nims before K2.
You never
So
even met him, in fact, before the mountain, right?
I met only once in a program in Kathmandu. It was just hi and hello only. We didn't talk much. I had lots of bad impression from him, from many friends. But when I met him, it was okay for me. Because I was leading my team, and he was leading his team. I was not working for him. Maybe they were a bit nervous that we could take the title first, and okay, this just made a commitment that we can work together. Since you want Nebel's name, we can go together. But Nims was like a bit afraid because there were like many other foreign friends who were also looking for K2, and they started doing preparations. They were going up the mountain, coming down, and they were acclimatizing. And he was scared that if we make a week delay, then our foreign friends,
The other teams, yeah.
they might get acclimatized and they might take the title. So on 31st of December, we fixed the Camp 3 and we went down. And Nimsli, they were like quite impressed with our work on the mountain because in a week we opened all the way from Camp 1 to Camp 3 by 3 Sherpa. We repaired all the way. We just came down to base camp and he said like, we should start back tonight and we should try summit on 2nd of January. And I said, look, it's not going to happen with us. If you want to go, since you're a Nepal team, we have our food on the mountain, we have our tent, we have our gas, We have our climbing gear there. You can use those. You can go. It was not necessary for me to reach the summit first. So I told him the same. And all of a sudden, I think his mind changed. He said, wow, you're a different person than I thought. That was what Nim said. He was like quite impressed with those things. And then he said, okay, brother, whenever you say, I'll be going with you guys.
Excellent.
And because he's very clever. Because he's very clever. Yeah. And he said like, okay, on the summit day, doesn't matter, we will reach the summit first. The first one will wait the last one, and we're gonna go together all the way, like holding the hands.
Yeah.
He made that plan. And we were climbing, and on the summit day, Mingma Tenzing, one of Nim's partner, he was the one who fixed the way on the summit day. And my two Sherpa, they were a bit ahead of us, and they wait there. We all reached there. We made a line, 10 people on a line, holding the hands. And then we started singing our national anthem, and we marched towards the summit. Yeah,
Amazing.
Yeah.
And was that, that you can see the response from people here that it feels like a magical moment. Was it magical for you, or were you just too tired or too?
It was so magical.
Yeah.
Regional summit, my eyes, all of a sudden, I was in tears. I couldn't speak much at the time. So friends from base camp, they were like, okay, hi, you reached the summit, congratulations, so many things. I could barely reply to them. I was in a deep happiness, but I could not express at the time. It was the same with so many friends on that day.
Yeah.
And there was a funny incident. We were like 10 Sherpa climbers, and it was like long queue, right? And we were like taking a selfie stick, and it's not a good idea. Yeah. Because only few people in the camera, right?
Yeah.
So we made like two lines, and we realized that later. All the tall guys, they were in front. All the short guys, they were back.
So there was even question about was everybody up there? In the pictures, you couldn't see some of the
Then the
people.
question raised from there.
Yeah. What were the conditions like? What was the coldest it was during that expedition?
We are very lucky on the summit day. At night, it was very cold, 7,800 meters. I almost quit there because I was feeling so cold.
Yeah.
And I thought I'm gonna lose my toe and hands, and I didn't want that because I lived my life seeing my father.
Yeah.
So I didn't want that life. So at a point I wanted to quit. I said, okay, I'm going to quit here, and I'll go down, and you guys have safe summit and come down. And my two Sherpa, like my two friends were in my team, they said like, if you're not going, we're also not going. We're not going. And they were carrying ropes. If they come down, there won't be any success. Because my two Sherpa, they were carrying almost like 400-meter ropes. So, and one of my Sherpas, he said like, we work so hard for this. We cannot give up that easily. Then I took a rest there, and all of a sudden the sun came out. It was a luck. Sometimes you put lots of effort in making things happen. When you don't have luck, it doesn't happen. I was lucky on that day. I was going to quit, and the sun came out. No wind, very clean weather.
Very warm for winter, or very?
Yeah, very warm temperatures.
Okay.
Mingma David, even he took out his shoes, dry his socks at 8,200 meters.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Because I know I'd read that the lowest temperature that was recorded on the trip, at one point, it was minus 58 at one of the nights.
Yeah. In Camp 2, it was so cold. When we started in the bad weather, and it was very, very cold.
Yeah.
And the next day, 14th January, the weather was showing very bad. Nim's team, they were planning to take a rest in 7,000 meters. And we said, if we could make summit, it's going to be on 15 or 16. After that, there's no chance. And I told Nims that, okay, we want to continue, what will you do? And he said, like, let's wait for another hour, and we'll see. And in the morning, the sun came out. It was very warm, almost no wind. Then we started going up to Camp 3.
It was supposed to happen.
Yeah.
now that you've not only climbed K2 in the summertime, you've also climbed it in the wintertime, that elevates you as a mountain guide to be able to do anything. So tell us a little bit about your guiding these days. How many expeditions do you go on a year?
So last year I started from Annapurna. When I was on Annapurna, there was accident on Everest. 3 Sherpa died, and those were my Sherpas. They were responsible for fixing the rope on the mountain, and they were crossing over the Kumbhais Fall. It was not their mistake, but a big block of ice fall down, and they were just under the ice, and we lost them there. So I started from Annapurna. Then after that, I was on Everest. Then after that, I went to Pakistan for Nanga Parbat. But that time I was just guiding because I just had accident on Everest in my team. So I didn't want to make my family worried. So after that, I went to Nanga Parbat. Then I went to K2, Broad Peak. Then Manaslu, and Choyu, Shishapama. That's where I got the accident.
So that's a year for you.
Yeah.
Yeah, to do that many trips, yeah.
Right.
And do you know how exceptional that is? That's something special? Do you know that?
I think it's just my job.
Just to make a point, this is my job. It's easier than that.
Right. Yeah.
So, when you're doing all this now, you've got a company, Imagine Nepal, that is leading all these trips. You've got a number of people that work for you. You're doing whatever you can to make sure that these people are trained and so on. I want to spend the last few minutes that we have talking a little bit about where you see things right now with particularly high altitude guiding. Because, I think there's a number of people in this room even probably who wonder whether it's something that should be happening. Because we hear all the stories about there's too many climbers, the Nepalese government's allowing everybody to go onto the mountains, and it seems like there's a problem. Do you think it's a problem right now?
I think there will be a bigger problem in the future now. That's what I see on the mountain. Now there are lots of guiding companies coming from nowhere.
Yeah.
And when they are established, they want to have more and more clients. And they just accept the client without their previous climbing experience, right? They just focus on earning money only now. And another thing is that the number of strong Sherpa is decreasing.
Why?
Because since this is risky job, now I'm climbing, but I don't want my children to be in this field. And that's actually what my parents, they wanted. Now the Sherpa families, people used to live in 5,000 meter or 4,000 meter, and they used to work there. They had more physical work all the time. And they were physically very strong.
So very trained.
Yeah, very trained. And they were ready to climb any mountain at any time. But now they are migrated to Kathmandu, into lower altitude, and they try to live their life relaxed one. No more physical work, right? And more Sherpa, they are getting education, and they are choosing different other field, not climbing, because they find it more risky. And also now lots of the Sherpa in Nepal, they get to Kathmandu and they go to different other countries and they get settled here. I have lots of friends who got settled in Japan, Canada, and US. The number of clients is increasing, but the number of Sherpas is decreasing. And the quality of Sherpa is going down now. The company has to hire the Sherpa, so they randomly hire the Sherpas from anywhere.
Without experience.
Without experience.
Yeah.
I think you heard a story on Everest from 2021 where they said we lost 60 bottles of oxygen from South Col, something like that. They were not lost. They didn't hire a good Sherpa, so the staff could not take all the oxygen to Camp 4. But they need a reason to tell their clients, okay, we lost our 60 bottles of oxygen in South Col, now we have to stop here. We cannot go for the summit. Then the clients, they accept, okay.
So you have a voice now. You've done some very important things. You're leading a leading company. Is there something that you want to see happen for the future of climbing in your country? Is there some regulation that should happen?
We have a problem with our government. Corruption is the biggest problem in a developing country, and we have the same. So we try to approach the government that if somebody wants to climb Everest, they should have at least 6,000 meter peak experience. But the government is happy, okay, from one foreigner, we get 11,000 directly to government account. So anybody can come for Everest. That's the problem. So we have been suggesting them so many rules, good thing, but government never listened. They just are focused on the money they get from foreign friends.
So again, one of the things that you have done with your voice that you do have is advocacy work around cleaning. Do you think that things are going to change, or do you worry that things are just going to get worse?
It's getting worse and worse now. On the high altitude, you need to be physically very strong all the time. So people struggle taking loads to like 8,000 meters, like on average. After the summit, mostly the new generation of Sherpa, they get so tired. They get tired easily because they're physically not capable now. So they keep the rubbish there.
They just dump it in and
they just try to take their clients and they just go down as soon as possible. And they just leave everything. Even like they leave their tent, so they leave their clothes, everything. It was not like this previously. Because the Sherpa, they were very strong. In my guiding company, most of the Sherpa, they were like 44 years, 45 years, 48 years, 53 years. And when my clients come and visit them, they say like, oh, he looks old, right? But after the climbing, they said, we are the perfect Sherpa. Because they still live in higher places. They like living in their hometown. They go to the jungle, they get firewoods, they get like 50 kg, 60 kg. This is their daily life.
Yeah.
So on the mountain, 60 kg, 50 kg, they can easily carry. But for the Sherpa from Kathmandu, they cannot. 20 kg is very happy for them. And things that they can speak like fluent English, but on the mountain, your English doesn't help you. Right? Yeah. That's the thing.
I want to leave you, I guess, with a hope that when you told the story a few minutes ago about the 10 of you arm in arm going to the top of K2, and you talked about it as magic. It's a magic that a lot of us here are familiar with, to know what it feels like in our hearts to be in those places. And I hope that carries you forward and strengthens your voice to make the difference that you want to make in your mountains, because I think it's a privilege to be there and an amazing thing, and a real privilege to have you here. This has been just wonderful.
Thank you. Thanks, David. Oh, sorry.
Make sure to follow Mingma G on Facebook or Instagram at mingma.g. Join the festivities and help us celebrate 50 years of adventure stories at the heart of the festival here in Banff. Check out our website at banffmountainfestival.ca. This episode was produced by Anik C and is a production of Banff Centre for Arts and Creativity. The theme music was composed by Jacques Blackstone. A special thanks to our audio engineer Ben Ewing and the production team at Banff Centre, as well as the folks from the Paul D. Fleck Library.